The other day, I went in search of a class or API that was already available to access RSS feeds within a .NET program on Microsoft Windows. I was quite sure that something like that existed. So I went and I searched for it, and I found that indeed there was an RSS toolkit, and this RSS toolkit had been in use for quite some time, and that when you look at the article for the RSS toolkit, it suggests that you look at the syndication API instead of using the RSS toolkit. So I was fine either way. This will save me a lot of time, and since I am coming into it at this point pretty much fresh, I can use the syndication API without having to worry about migrating to or migrating from the RSS toolkit. So I went through some of the code examples that was associated with both migrating from the RSS toolkit to the syndication API, and I found it to be pretty straightforward. What I had envisioned in my mind to begin with was to use the HTTP client class to download the feed file, or download the latest feed as a file, and then parse it through XML, as I did in the C++ version. But with the syndication API, there is a much easier way to do this that will save several steps. So I'm going to use this example for the syndication API throughout this discussion. So I went and I looked at the syndication API, and it seems fairly straightforward. There are a number of classes and a number of types there that can be used to peruse a RSS feed that has come back over the HTTP endpoint, and that will be quite favorable to streamlining the coding and the development of this part of the software project. So I have several tabs open right now where I want to keep this article and keep this information in view, because I will refer to it a couple of times. And it's always helpful to have documentation available when you're going through development, so that you have a reliable anchor for what you're going to do. So I'm going to bring up the software project that I'm working on that deals with RSS feeds. And my overall objective here is to get it to a format where I'm going to integrate in RSS feed processes and steps in a very incremental way. That is, I'm not going to rush to the end of the process, but I'm going to take it one step at a time in pretty much the same way that I did when I was building the C++ version. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a console version of the RSS feed process. Right, I'm going to build a console app or console program that will allow me to more directly interact with the RSS feeds and deal with them on the level of data, as opposed to user interface interactivity. So I went through and I looked at the feed class that I'm already using, and part of the reason why I did that was to first familiarize myself with what I have in place already, but also I was more of the opinion that, or I was searching my mind to see if I even needed to use what I had already put in place, given that the syndication API already has the equivalent of what I had put in place in the C++ realm, right? And then I decided, you know what? I'm going to maintain the API I've already developed, and I'm going to integrate that API with the syndication API from Microsoft. So I'll merge the two APIs together just to make things not only easier, but to streamline the development as well. So I decided to do that and take that course. And then I was looking at the user interface to see if the user interface class, the main user interface class, just to see if there were any clues or hints here that would guide my decision on where to take things next. And it was around this time where I said, it's going to be much more productive and more favorable to what I'm doing to keep everything in alignment from a console standpoint, from a console application standpoint. So one of the ways that I work, and one of the habits that I have, is to often refer back to documentation, because as I do that, I'm building a model in my mind, a framework, as it were, of how the overall system is going to operate. And one of the things I thought back to was this RSS Net Client class that I created. And this is going to be one of the main points of entry for the software application when it comes to downloading RSS feed information into the SQLite database. So one of the things that I wanted to do is put in place a stub function of sorts that would at least set the groundwork for the makings of an architecture. And so this stub function at this stage of the development is going to be concerned with getting all the articles for a given feed. One of the questions that arose was, what was the format of the data that was being presented to the software application, and what was the format of the input into this class in order to identify the relevant feed. So once again, I decided to stick with the API I've already established, and that API is then going to be linked to the syndication API that I recently discovered. So the process here is pretty straightforward in terms of like pseudocode. You basically have a collection of articles, and you're going to use the syndication API in conjunction with the XML reader class to pull down the information in XML format, and then the syndication API will parse the retrieved information and put it into a structure that is easier to interrogate or to process within the software application. So Here I am basically following the template that's more or less indicated by the code example that I have loaded in Mozilla Firefox. So with that code example, basically I'm able to type out the proper class name and then use Visual Studio's IntelliSense and IntelliCode infrastructure to set up the package dependencies and do all of that stuff. Saves a lot of clicks. So I really like that productivity, and I like that efficiency. So as you see, I'm building the project. Just want to see if our IntelliSense, what do you call that, autocorrect or error syntax check is actually valid. You know what I find funny about this is that the code example on the web page declares a variable in exactly the same way, right? So it's like, what are we really saying here, right? What are we really saying? Are we saying that, that there's a process here that we are unaware of? I don't think so. I just think that based on how you have your Visual Studio solution or project set up, you may get error messages more or less along these lines, right? And I have my warnings and error checking level ramped up. So that's why I'm receiving that error, where in other cases you may not see that, right? So, and those settings are controlled in this case through the config file. So I'm going to ignore that syntax error for now and deal with it later, and move on with setting up the codes the way that I want. Now, I should make note at this point that everything that I'm doing here is pretty much an exercise in familiarizing myself with this API. As simple as the code example is, it's still helpful to go through the process of understanding what is taking place, right? And one of the best ways to do that is through a kinesthetic approach, right? Where you're hands-on and you interact with this process in a very deliberate way, in a somewhat detailed way. And so this will build successfully, which is fine, but it still doesn't really do anything. So although you see code there, that code doesn't actually deliver what it seems to indicate that it would deliver. So to rectify that, one of the things that I have on the agenda today is to set up a console project that is going to allow me to grab feeds from different web addresses, different websites, and I want to save those feeds to a file. I want to save the feeds to a local XML file. And the reason that I want to do that is that allows me to work with the API and work through the iterations and the modifications to the program up until the point where where the program is stable, and do so in a way where I'm not constantly slamming the websites. I'm not constantly hitting the websites, right? So when it comes to accessing RSS feeds, you have to be very careful about how often you make requests to the website that publishes those feeds, because there are often policies in place. That would block you if you access the feeds from a given website too often within a certain range of time. So you'll see an example of that in a couple of minutes. But for now, I just want to lay out what the overall architectural and design agenda is. And that's going to be the course of action going forward. To start this, it's going to be helpful to, again, get a couple of RSS feeds and set up a console project that is going to basically allow us to download those websites, download the data from those RSS feed sources, right? And in my other videos dealing with the C++ version of this program, I have very intricate examples of that process, and this is very similar, but because of the nature of .NET and C#, it's a much more streamlined process. And I'm going to take the naming convention that's implied in the structure of the solution and use that for the name of the project. As I've said many times in the past, names are very important. It's extremely important what we name different things, right? And I use a very simple naming scheme in the C++ version of the project, but here I want to stick to a dotted name convention, and also have within that overall fully qualified name an indication of what the project actually does. And in this case, the name feed downloader, or feed downloader, it seems like a very appropriate and straightforward indication of what is being done in the case of this project, right? And I'm going to set it to .NET 7, and I want to make sure that I do this in a very straightforward way. So I'm going to set it up to not use top-level statements, but more or less go at things in a very straightforward, structured, and conventional way. So we know that the templates that are used to generate these projects are very stable, but even with that said, I'm just going to make a slight tweak here, modification, and then run it just to make sure that we are all on the same page as far as Visual Studio, C#, and the operating system, and so on. So let's go ahead and build and run that, and once it builds successfully, we'll go ahead and run this just to make sure that everything is bootstrapped the way that it needs to be. And you'll notice that the project is highlighted, right, in bold within Visual Studio, and so that means it's a startup project. And I'm also adding a reference to the data project, because ultimately this console program is going to be used to develop and evolve that data class, the data class library, to a level that's going to be productive when the user interface tries to use it to bring back data that it needs. So as we can see, we got the output that we expected and anticipated, and everything is in good shape. So far so good. And the next sequence here is just to see about getting the data that we need to get started with this development. The development of the API that will direct the RSS feed data into the SQLite database instance that's associated with this program. There are a couple of ways to do that. So I stopped and I contemplated just taking the existing RSS database from the C++ version and just going at it that way. But I decided that I wanted to make sure the data was more recent and more up to date. And I just wanted to go through a process that is a little bit more straightforward and a little less boilerplate, should we say, at least in the beginning. So I'm going to use Notepad++, and one of the reasons why I use Notepad++ on Windows is that it automatically saves whatever it is you paste into a new text document. So you don't have to rush out and give the text document a name. So it's a pretty productive feature. As you saw, I did a Google search for RSS feeds associated with one of the websites I want to interrogate or access from an RSS standpoint. And through the miracle of Google and all of its machinations, we're able to easily and readily get access to those RSS feed sources. And you'll notice what I highlight here is this particular website operator. They don't want you to access it more than once every 30 minutes. So if you do, they will block you. And if you're trying to develop using them as a real-time source of RSS feeds, that's a no-go. And that's another reason why downloading a file snapshot of the feed data is going to be very useful. So what I'm doing here is I'm gathering all of the web addresses, the URLs, the uniform resource indicators, the HTTP endpoints, whatever you want to call it, right? It's many names, but it's all the same. Well, not pedantically anyway, but in terms of colloquially and in terms of the common understanding of what we're doing here, we're getting the web addresses, and we're going to use those to grab the data at those web addresses and save it to a file that we can reuse in the development. And along the way, we might get distracted. That's fine. We might see an article that catches our eye as we're copying and pasting RSS URLs, right? I saw an article about Red Hat and source code, and I think there's no major alarms there, but I do applaud the community in general for keeping an eye on that and such things, just to make sure that nothing weird's going on. I meant to look for the RSS feed for DistroWatch, but I ended up finding DistroTube. And DistroTube is a great channel on YouTube. I like their content, but I'm looking for DistroWatch in this particular case. And so I got DistroWatch finally, and I'm going to plug that into the set of RSS feeds that I hope to retrieve. And as you see, the formats are all XML, but they are also somewhat different as well. So I like that. I like that diversity, because that is going to hopefully make the program stronger and give it a much broader scope in terms of how it's able to deal with the feeds. So I've closed all those tabs, and I want to take the focus towards using these RSS URLs in the program to pull down the information into a file. So the initial pretty much straightforward response to that is to say, okay, let's just put them all in a list, in an array-like list, and let's just go through the URLs one by one and download the information to a file. That sounds straightforward, and indeed that can be done, and indeed that will be done, but not by just using the URLs by themselves, right? And even though I kind of started out that way because, that's just a nice, gut reaction, ultimately what needs to be done is to not only have the URLs, but to identify what is the URL, or what is the content represented by that URL. Because what are you going to call the file name? You're going to call the file name 1234? I mean, that could be just a tad confusing or unclear when working with the data day to day. So, once I go through this sequence of setting this up and immediately realizing I'm not going to do this, right? I'm basically going to convert this to a format that's going to be much more productive and will leverage the existing feed API that I've put in place to accomplish that productivity. And that is to use the feed class itself so that I can identify the URL by name, as well as have a spot for the URL itself in association with that name. But for now, it's kind of just a little quick, easy, fun to just go through and pretend like I'm going to do something substantial with just these lists of strings. And basically following the template that was outlined in the code example for the syndication API. And then I'm going to work through different steps to convert that to an actionable result in terms of the software application. One of those steps is to identify where on the computer those feed files are going to be stored and saved. And I'm just going to pick a directory out of thin air, namely one that we'll just make up, right? And the first thing I want to do is make sure that the variable name represents the type of entity that we'll be interacting with, which in this case is a directory. So I'm going to set up what's called a verbatim string so that I don't have to escape the / character and type out the physical file path. In this case, RSS feeds. And then I'm going to use the directory class, the static methods on the directory class, to see if the directory already exists, and if it doesn't, let's go ahead and create that directory. That will avoid a file not found exception and will also allow the program to actually work. right? That's a good thing. And with that accomplished, right? The other thing that we'll need to do, in addition to making those feed URL or that list of feed URLs um, more usable, is to concatenate that directory path variable to a file path variable, because each feed is going to be saved to a actual file path. But here I'm doing the quick conversion of the API that's used for the items, right? And in the overall scheme of things, it's a pretty quick operation, though there may be a Visual Studio-esque operation or shortcut that can convert from a list of strings to an API. Maybe some future IntelliSense method will be produced that will do that if one doesn't currently exist. Or maybe I will be a product manager for Microsoft one day when they decide to make a wholesale conversion of the Windows kernel to the Linux kernel. But until such time, all I can do is speculate about what kind of improvements would be beneficial in utilizing these tools. So with that modification there that you just saw, that's pretty much the indication of, that pretty much indicates how I'm going to go about iterating through each URL and ensuring that we have a file name that is that represents the contents of that file in terms of what feed it is best associated with. And it is true that, yes, we're going to work with the file data in a program, but because we're also going to periodically read the file in a text editor, then it also helps to have it in a human-friendly format in terms of the initial identification of that data in the file name itself, at least in this particular process, this development process, you might say. So there's a name for each one, and we have the URL for each one as well. One thing that hasn't changed since, I think, Visual Studio, not 2015, but I think this goes even before then. When you do, see, the terminology escapes me at the moment, but when you have array elements like this, collection elements declared in line like this, right? It would be very useful for Visual Studio to format them, right? Because if you press Control-K, Control-D, it's not going to format it the way I'm doing it manually here. But it'd be nice if there was if it did do that. I think that would be a little bit more streamlined. But maybe that's also a setting that you can do in the configuration of the different text tools in your preferences. So I like the structure of that list now. We got essentially name value pairs that will be used to access the information, and we're able to make an easy conversion with the URL as we iterate through each item. Now comes the more interesting, and you might say lengthier part, which is to actually take that information and save it to a file. Sounds easier sounds easier than it actually is because there are multiple steps. First, you have to download the file. First you have to bring in the information, right? Okay, and so you're going to retain that information in memory. And by the way, I have a syntax, or not a syntax error, but I have a API usage error just now. That's just not flagged in any meaningful way, but I am concatenating the file extension using the combine method of the path class, right? But it's going to give me an error later on about that. So that's not the proper way to bring a file extension to a file name. But anyway, so you got to bring that data into memory, and then once that data is in memory, then you have to get to the point of inputting that data into an API that's going to direct those contents to a file. So the file path that I've set up is part of the solution for that. But this XML writer is the other part, because that's what's going to actually save the information, or save the information to a physical file. It's pretty straightforward. But there's no direct connection between an XML reader and an XML writer. So I went and I did some searching to see if others have already worked with this. I've actually done this before, but it was many years ago. So my muscle memory is not there on this particular procedure, which is why we have search engines and ChatGPT and so on and so forth, right? But it's always nice to look, because if you do that, then you may pick up some other useful pieces of information along the way that is pertinent to what you're wanting to do. Here's a solution I've actually used in the past, quite extensively actually, using a memory stream. But my goal is to do things in a much more condensed and much more streamlined way. So while I do attempt to use this, about halfway through the process of trying to put this particular approach in place, I realized that it's not the right move at all. One of the reasons why it's not the right move in 2023 is that there's just way more steps involved than are necessary. But like I said, I'm going to attempt to do it because, like I said, I've done it many times in the past over many years, and it's a very effective approach, and it's also a great way to optimize performance in certain situations. But in this case, it's completely unnecessary. And as I'm writing code, I'm seeing the interactions, and I'm like, wait, hold on, this actually isn't going to work. So my first clue is I'm trying to read off of a memory stream that I just declared. That's not where I'm trying to read information from. I'm trying to read it from the website URL, right? So, and then I'm going to write to the memory stream. That doesn't make any sense either. So that's when it's like, okay, yeah, and I could have fixed all of that up, but it was simply a good nudge to be like, oh, wait, there is a proper way to do this that is much more streamlined. So I saw the link over here, and I looked at it, and I was like, oh, you know what? If you're using a data reader, then, and that data reader is bringing back an XML reader, then I can use that XML reader that I'm already creating to write the information in exactly the same way. So that seemed pretty straightforward at that point to do that. You just have to know where the API functions, how they interact with each other. So I rolled back what I was doing there, and I was thankful for that. I was thankful that I didn't go too far in that. And then it's like, okay, let's start to let's write the node, and it's going to interpret the entire document as a node, starting with the root node, and it's pretty straightforward from there. Don't you just love it when a plan comes together, as they say? So we have good progress on that so far. And I'm just going to be verbose with the XML that's written out. That's not a problem. That's usually a good thing, because oftentimes when you try to develop it to be less verbose, right, and then the point comes where you do need to interpret the document in a much more strict way or granular way, using fully qualified names and XML namespaces and the like, then you're out of luck if you've geared your code towards a more simplified interpretation of the XML. So let's go ahead and run this. Like I said, I'm going to get an error based on the way the file path has been constructed. But other than that, the code is pretty much flawless. And then once I correct that, everything's going to work pretty well. But again, I'm on a Pentium processor, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but it does take a while for Visual Studio's debugging infrastructure to come online. There it goes. So we got a console window, and at this point I'm assuming everything's going to work just fine, because I'm unaware of the API usage error. And I see that the folder is created, but there are no files in the folder yet. And then when I see this, I'm like, oh, it's waiting to tell me about an exception. And I'm just waiting for the inevitable news that, so I do like the clarity of that error message. It told me right away what I needed to change. So I started looking through the path class to look for extension and all that kind of stuff, and there's nothing like that there as far as appending an extension, right? Which is fine. It's more of getting an existing extension. But I'm going to use an interpolated string. I say that 3 times fast. Interpolated string, yes. So I'm going to use an interpolated string to bring in the file extension, and just that one little tweak, and we are good to go. So let's run it again. And then I'm going to position the window view where the folder is, because I just want to see the files created in real time. It's a little entertaining. It's a little small joys you get when writing software code. And there they are. There are no error messages, and I expect the files to fully reflect the contents from the websites. We're going to open each one in Notepad++, even though my muscle memory keeps wanting to go off to the right side of the right-click context menu. Right? Look, I keep trying to do open with. That's funny. But anyway, so there they are, and got all the files in place, and that's actually a success at this point. And what that is going to allow is that's going to allow me to rapidly build up the remaining parts of this application in terms of its ability to access internet websites in real time over the network. But I'll be able to do it without accessing the network in the beginning, so as not to rile up or cause issues with those website operators. So I'm pretty pleased with that so far, and I am happy with this milestone. And now that these files are here and together, they will serve as the backbone for using the syndication API and linking that syndication API with the API I developed for the user interface. And so I hope you found this journey through .NET and RSS feeds illuminating and enlightening. And if you have any questions at all, please feel free to post them into the comments. Ask any question at all that you are comfortable asking, and I'll see the notification about your comments, and I'll try to respond in as timely a fashion as I can. And know that the next couple of videos that come after this, they may or may not be as detailed as this one, right? Because my real goal is really to build this program out and get it to a functional state that hopefully I can get listed into the Microsoft Store, right? But I wanted to document the journey as I'm moving through this process, and if my steps that I take are helpful to others out there, then I say all the better, right? And that's really the purpose of these videos, is just to share information and have information available to others who are on a similar path or who want a preview of that path, so that it makes their lives a little easier in dealing with open source technology, dealing with the sharing of information and the growth and the emergence of new innovations that will help streamline things and transform how we interact with computer systems. So that's really what my aim is. And then at some point, I may involve artificial intelligence through different methods from the OpenAI Foundation. And that is going to be a very exciting endeavor once I reach that point. But I'm going to do that in the Linux world primarily. And if there is a use case to do that in the Windows world, then I'll pursue it then. Thank you.